Jewish Hebrews could live in harmony with the Moorish Mohammedanism, why can't today Christianity and Islam live in harmony?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. First of all, for all of you, and most of you already be aware of this, but there was a kind of glory period, in round numbers, around the year 1000. Okay, went on for maybe 300 years, but maybe 900 to 1200, I'm not sure of the exact dates either, of living together in a kind of wonderfully interconnected way amongst Muslims, Jews, and Christians in Moorish Spain. And there are a couple of very fine and interesting books written about that have come out recently. And as you suggested in asking the question, we have this historical example of these three traditions living in exceptional harmony and connectedness with each other. And I think you're right. That means it's possible for the future as well. But to suggest something more, first of all, there's probably more Christian-Muslim interaction in the best sense of the word now in this country than there was prior to 2001. Because I think a lot of progressive Christian communities, and I don't even know if the word progressive applies to Muslim communities, but some of them are, but I don't know if they would use that language, is what I meant. But cooperative relationships between congregations and mosques and interconnections of that kind are developing. The other comment I would make, I guess, is, well, first a general one, but I'll try to keep it brief. I think Islam is a wonderful religion. And I feel more in common with mystically minded Muslims than I do with hard, doctrinally minded Christians. Okay? And I think many of us have had similar experiences with people of other religious traditions. And so I see Islam as one of the world's great religions. I mean, what else could you say? I mean, and I don't mean that just what else can you say, but I mean it is. Okay? And then the third and more specific comment is that we need to recognize that there's a lot of very deliberate fear-mongering in this country about Islam. A lot of negative stereotypes that are carried forward by Fox News, conservative talk radio, some Christian evangelists. Some of you may have seen the email blurb this week about, what's his name, Parsley in Ohio, whom John McCain had named as one of his spiritual guides, speaking about Islam as, he didn't use the word from the devil, but basically from the devil, and that it should be destroyed. This is a man that John McCain named as one of his spiritual guides. I think McCain was being polite because this guy had introduced him, but nevertheless. The point is not so much John McCain here at all, but it's that there is a fear-mongering, I'm saying the obvious, about Islam out there that, if you run into it in conversations, probably none of you ever do, but if you run into it in conversations, kindly challenge it by just saying, oh, that isn't true. You don't have to know a lot to say that. Yeah. Oh, I don't know where you heard that. Yeah. And I thank you for that. I want to take another 30 seconds to send you off with a benediction. And if you've heard me before, you've heard this benediction. It's a favorite of mine. It's actually a journal entry from a French-speaking Swiss Calvinist pastor, Henri, the French Henry, Henri Amiel, He was a mystic and a depressive, and they sometimes go together. This is from his journal for January of 1868. Sorry, of December of 1868. Life is short, and we do not have too much time to gladden the hearts of those who travel the way with us. So, be swift to love and make haste to be kind. And the blessings of God, Creator, Christ, and ever-present Spirit be with you this evening and forevermore. Amen. I look forward to seeing some of you tomorrow. Good night.
Dr. Borg, will you speak to us about the more than literal meaning of the Old Testament passages that reference man as being made in the image of God?
Okay, when I speak about the metaphorical meaning of the Old Testament passages, speaking of human beings made in the image of God, I don't have a clue what that means. Better yet, I've heard a number of suggestions. None of them seem obviously to me to be the most persuasive one. Let me begin with a negative comment. I don't imagine for a moment that it means that God looks like us, or that because we are persons who think, God is a person who thinks. Okay? I don't think it's that kind of copying, if you will. And beyond that, I suppose the understandings that I find kind of least objectionable, maybe, and I don't know if I would want to say most persuasive, would be to say that that we are capable of relationship with God. And I don't mean to imply that only the human species is capable of relationship with God. For all we know, dolphins and other higher mammals may be. And then I want to add, in one sense, everything is in relationship to God, rocks, stars, and so forth. But I'm talking about consciousness of that relationship. And I'm not sure that that's what the biblical writers meant by it. The other quick comment I'll make is how the image of God is handled within the Celtic Christian tradition, because it's an alternative to the notion of original sin. The notion of original sin, which is not biblical, by the way, it emerges in the 5th century. And in some ways, it's a terrible mistake. In other ways, if you understand it properly, you can kind of see what it's getting at. But the terribly mistaken way of understanding it is that it is transmitted through sexual intercourse. Therefore, we are all born with it, and even a one-day-old baby is a sinner, which is why through the Christian Middle Ages and the Reformation, children were commonly baptized at 2 or 3 days of age so that they didn't die unbaptized because they were sinners already. I mean, that's just a terrible understanding of it, okay? Within the Celtic Christian tradition, to get back to the image of God, the understanding is that we are created in the image of God, and the image of God remains with us. Some understandings of original sin speak of the image of God being lost through original sin. Okay? But for Celtic Christianity, the image of God remains within us. Think of it as being like a mirror, a reflector, if you will. But the process of growing up begrimes that image, that reflector, tarnishes it. And tarnish is almost too weak a word. Think of it, covers it with a layer of grime. And then the Christian life is about the removing of that grime that obscures the image of God within us so that we can once again become fully conscious of our relationship with God.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. And question that I have is, how do we reconcile with the fact that the Bible, which is the tool that we have for the Christian language, seems to call for us, especially in many passages, to take it literally, such as, the story of Jesus meeting with the disciples after he was, came from the tomb, and he said, "Look at the spear hole in my side and the holes in my hand." I mean, it's calling for us to take it literally. So how can we reconcile with that?
Okay, a couple of comments. My favorite way of illustrating a parabolic or metaphorical reading of the Easter stories is the story of the Emmaus Road, which is the gospel text for tomorrow, and I'll be preaching on it. So I'm not going to use that one today. Okay? Let me use the story in John 20, which is one of the stories in which Jesus displays the wounds in his hands and feet and side to his followers. This is the story of Jesus appearing to Thomas, of course. Now, the question is, does the author of John intend us to understand that story literally and factually? There are clues in the story that suggest maybe not. You may remember that Jesus in John's Gospel appears to the 10 disciples on Easter evening. Thomas is not there, and Judas is now dead, of course. So Thomas is not there, and the 10 disciples tell him, "The Lord has appeared to us." And Thomas says, "Unless I see with my own eyes and touch the wounds in his side and so forth, I will not believe." By the way, when I was growing up, there was only one thing worse than being a doubting Thomas, and that was to be a Judas. I mean, Thomas was not a role model, okay? And then a week later, the disciples with Thomas are in, John tells us, a locked room, and suddenly Jesus appears in their midst. Now, whatever is going on here, it's not what we think of as a physical body. I don't know if we're supposed to think it passed through the walls or simply suddenly manifested itself. But they're in a locked room, and suddenly Jesus appears in their midst, and his first words are, "Do not be afraid," which is usually how a manifestation of the sacred appears in the Bible. That is, an angel appears. "Fear not." Okay. So the risen Christ appears to them in a locked room. And then the rest of the story is basically a conversation between Thomas and Jesus. And Thomas's exclamation is, "My Lord and my God," because he is invited to put his hands in the wounds of Jesus. Now, the story ends with the words, "Do you believe because you have seen? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." And depending upon how you inflect those words, they can be an accusation of Thomas, like, "You had to see to believe? What's wrong with you?" Or you can hear them as simply saying, "Blessed are those who have not had an experience like this," and not as condemnation. Perhaps the most direct connection to your question is this. I have no doubt that the followers of Jesus had visions of him after his death. Visions intrinsically include a visual manifestation. That's what the word vision means, okay? And importantly, visions can include a tactile sense. Dreams sometimes do. I think all of us can remember dreams in which there's a sense of touching. So visions can include a sense of tactility, if you will. But it doesn't mean that you could have videotaped what was happening there if you had been there with a video camera. Or to put that differently, suppose Pilate had been in that room with the followers of Jesus. Do we imagine that Pilate would have seen Jesus? That would be moving toward a literal, factual reading of the story. And it's interesting that in the Easter stories, Jesus never appears to outsiders. There's never a public appearance of Jesus in that sense. Now, I'm not trying to deny something here as much as I am trying to affirm something. That the conviction that Jesus lives and is Lord is grounded in experiences of Jesus, but to turn those into literal, factual events that in principle could have been photographed, I think is to misunderstand the story. Last comment. Every once in a while, somebody will say to me, "You mean it was only a vision?" And I simply want to say, anybody who's ever had a vision would never say, it was only a vision. So, but if you want the fuller treatment, come to church tomorrow. Okay.
The other night, I watched Fiddler on the Roof, and my question is, if God were involved so actively at the time of Jesus' birth, why would he not have been involved in the Russian and the German Holocaust that took place? Why is God not so evident in the terrible things that are happening in our lives today?
Yeah, it's a very important question and an illuminating one to think about. Let me begin with kind of the foundation of how I think this through. I believe in what can be called in shorthand divine consistency. Okay? Just think of the phrase for a moment, divine consistency. What I mean by that phrase is that I imagine that God acts in the same way now as God did in the past and vice versa. I don't think, in other words, that God acted in utterly spectacular ways in the history of ancient Israel and in the story of Jesus, and then did that to kind of kickstart the Jewish and Christian traditions, and then kind of became inactive ever since. Makes no sense to me at all. And this is among the reasons that I don't believe in what we commonly think of as divine intervention. Divine intervention implying that God chooses to intervene sometimes, and therefore implicitly chooses not to on other occasions. I just cannot believe in that. You could promise me the biggest reward imaginable, heaven decorated